My spirit abides among you. Do not fear. Once there was a minister with a vision. A faithful man, he was born and raised in the Midwest, good stock. Went to a small Methodist liberal arts school, good school. And was known in and around the region for his debating prowess, good work. He was a Rhodes Scholar and spent 3 years studying at Oxford University before moving back stateside and beginning ministry in earnest. Good choice. He served his first three churches in Michigan, 2 in the Detroit area and 1 in Pontiac. During those first 3 pastorates, he had the opportunity to earn a Doctor of Divinity degree from Nebraska Wesleyan University, a great school if you don't count Ohio Wesleyan University, and to visit at one point the Holy Land, Palestine, where, among many other things, he saw for the first time Solomon's quarry. And as the story goes, upon seeing Solomon's quarry, that place from which Solomon's dream of the first temple had been realized, Weldon Crosland made a commitment that someday when he built his church, he would use a rock from that quarry as the cornerstone. It would be built upon the same rock of the first temple of Solomon. By the time he received his call in 1932 to come to Asbury Methodist Episcopal Church in sunny Rochester, New York, he had 2 daughters and 42 years under his belt, a whippersnapper if ever there was one. He came this way and, of course, never left. Quite literally, he is interred just under the altar right there. In some ways, we already have a columbarium, friends. And there were many changes during those early years of Weldon Crosland's pastorate, not the least of which was in 1934 when they merged with First Methodist Episcopal Church to become Asbury First, after a fire burned First Church not for the first time, which among many other things meant that their building at 321 East Avenue was no longer large enough to hold their congregation. And they began to dream together about where God was calling them to go and how they might get there. My spirit abides among you. Do not fear. 2,500 years earlier and around the world, in 520 BCE-ish, another man stood and shared his vision. You see, it'd been a rough century for the Judeans. In 587, of course, the Babylonians had come into Jerusalem, sacked Jerusalem, and destroyed the first temple of Solomon. In other words, the place where God had lived, where they'd built their homes, their faith, their lives, was lost. And worse, so were they. You see, when the Babylonians took over Jerusalem, they took all of the elites from Judea into exile in Babylon, present-day Iraq. And there they were for 50 years in a different land with a different people who worshiped a different God. And they found themselves longing for a Savior. We know the feeling. Fortunately for them, they got one. Enter the Persians. In 538, Cyrus the Great, fighting Cyrus, came in with the Persians. He's the first person in our Bible to be called Messiah. Save that for Final Jeopardy. Cyrus the Great came in and conquered Babylon. There's always a bigger fish. And they allowed all of the Judeans to move back to Jerusalem. They were allowed to be in their home area again. Yes, technically they were still under the rule of a foreign power, which meant that they had to pay taxes to the foreign king and they had to abide by a governor he appointed, but at least they were home. And as Dorothy from that great Midwest state said, there's no place like home. Only the home to which they returned had changed. 50 years is enough time for things to change. People had moved on, and the Jerusalem to which they returned was not the Jerusalem they left. And they found themselves lost again. My spirit abides among you. Do not fear. Weldon Crosland dreamed of a big church. A really big church, not just in size, but in stature and influence around the city. Only his first decade of ministry amongst the people called Asbury First was lived during the Depression. Depressing. Which meant that his vision, his dream, had to wait, at least for now. Then, when the Depression ended, there came a glimmer of hope. Etta Dake, a woman whose husband William had fallen in love with Asbury First on his deathbed through the radio ministry, hello to those out there today, asked to have her husband's funeral led by Dr. Crosland. Dr. Crosland, of course, obliged. That's part of what we do, and he handled it with such grace that Etta decided then and there to join the church. And when she died, just over a year later, she bequeathed to the church a gift of just under $330,000 for, quote, a new church. That, combined with a gift from the Watson family of IBM fame, a little bit less than that amount from the Dake family, meant that the church could finally start to bring their dreams to reality. Sometimes all it takes is one person coming forward. And so they gathered the church together, not a day unlike today, December 1st, 1941, and they voted to move forward with a plan to raise the rest of the money, to find a new location, and to build a new church building that they could occupy within 3 to 6 years. And 6 days later, the attack on Pearl Harbor happened. And their dreams, as sometimes happens, were delayed. My spirit abides among you. Do not fear. The ancient Israelites had a choice to make. It's a choice we recognize perhaps all too well. They had to decide in that moment whether to continue to look back, mourning what used to be, or to look forward at that which is not yet. They were trying to decide whether to look back in sadness or to look forward in hope. Perhaps some of us find ourselves at that crossroads today. And for the first 18 years of their return, they chose the former. Sure, they moved on. They found a new rhythm of life, but every day, each and every day, they walked by the destroyed temple, the stones that are laying on top of one another, and shook their heads, tearful at what used to be, until finally, we don't know the circumstances that led up to it, but until finally, a man named Haggai, a prophet, a heck of a guy, had had enough. Sometimes, friends, that's what happens. We suddenly realize that we can't keep doing what it is that we're doing if we expect to fully live. And so he did something new. He called together Zerubbabel and the high priest and all of the remnant of the people Israel, and they gathered there in front of the destroyed temple, and he spoke the words that had been placed on his heart. He told the truth, that as beautiful as these stones are, they're just, in the end, stones. He said to them, "Do any of you remember this temple in all of its glory?" In some ways, it's sort of a rhetorical question. Remember, it fell in 587. It was now 520. They'd have to be at least 67 years old to even been alive, and much more if they were to remember. Let's call it 70, which for us today is very young. Very, very young. 70 is super young today, practically a spring chicken. You've all heard me say it, right? But in those days, 70 would have been old. Shocking, I know. In other words, he was reminding them that sometimes memory is more powerful than the truth. But the truth, as Jesus Christ would later promise, is what sets us free. That in the end, these are just stones. He reminded them that the God who was in that temple is the same God who walked with them as they made their way out of Egypt, is the same God who stood with them while they were in exile for 50 years, is the same God who was with them, and friends, who is with us right now. And then he offers that promise from God, the one that we all need to hear in our hearts each and every day: "My Spirit abides among you. Do not fear." Wherever you find yourself today, remember this, the promise of God: "My Spirit abides among you. Do not fear." My Spirit abides among you, not the stones, not the building, but you. Do not fear. He tells them that all the gold and the silver is already God's, that this is just what we are called to steward in the time that we have, that we are called to use the gifts that we have been given in the time that we have been given to use them, and that the latter glory of this temple will be better than the former. And free from the burden of the past, suddenly they were able to live. And in that moment, in the fall of 520 BCE, they began to build again. My Spirit abides among you. Do not fear. World War II meant delayed dreams for most of the world. For some, they were delayed forever. And while many were away fighting, some of whom are among us today, but more of whom are not, the people of Asbury First found their way to keep moving forward. They kept looking for a space where their new church might be built, even if they knew the building of it might be delayed for some time. And in a sign that nothing has changed in 70 years, they knew the best way to find a new building was by committee. And so they formed a committee that went and began to look around Rochester to study where the best place might be. And spoiler alert here, friends, they did find a location. Somewhere around, let's call it East Avenue and Berkeley, there were two adjacent old mansions that were starting to be run down and for whom the owners could no longer take care of, were glad to be able to take it off their hands. And in a special church conference in 1943, we voted to purchase 1040 and 1010 East Avenue for $16,500 and $18,000 respectively. The idea at the time was that we would tear down both buildings to make room for the church. Remember, Weldon Crosland dreamed big. But then in the last minute they decided, well, let's keep 1010. We'll fix it up temporarily as it might be good as a meeting house. Little did they know. Eventually they purchased 1050 East Avenue as well for $7,000. And when World War II ended, they began in earnest through several campaigns, through planning and committee after committee, to find their way to build their church, until finally, on February 22nd, 1953, in what must have been a really warm winter, they broke ground on this space, driving down the street with shovels in hand to each take part in digging the foundation. They realized their dream in the only way they could. Together. And in October of that year, Weldon Crosland got his wish. He flew to Solomon's Quarry and he found the right stone. And he brought it back through customs, got it shaped to the right size, hollowed it out, filled it with mementos for that auspicious occasion, and in October of 1953, laid it as the cornerstone for this church. Do you hear, friends? We stand on the same rock that faithful people have stood for generations. And now we hear the same promise, my Spirit abides among you. Do not fear. So much has changed, of course, in the last 70 years, not just our ministers, but our buildings. We have the education wing and the gathering center, and who could have imagined the way that we would use that temporary meeting house of 1010 East Avenue? If those bricks could talk, they would tell us stories of wedding receptions, of young adult groups and middle-aged adult groups and older adult groups. They would tell stories of Christian fellowship, of people walking alongside one another in and through the highs and lows of life. They would tell stories of the truth setting people free. They may tell the story of the beginning of the dining and caring center with a few peanut butter sandwiches all the way through today, where we serve 35,000 meals a year in that space. And they would be great stories worthy of celebration and honor. But if Haggai were here, he may stand in this very pulpit and remind us of another truth. That for as beautiful as those bricks and these stones are, in the end, friends, they're just bricks and stones. That what matters is not the buildings, but the people our buildings serve. Our mission at Asbury First is to love God and neighbor, to live fully, to serve all, and repeat. Life leads to love, and love leads us to service. That's part of the cycle of the Christian life. You can't take one piece away and expect it to make sense. It doesn't. That is how we live. Love, live, serve, repeat. That's how we find life together. And life, friends, you may remember, is the point. We heard how we might do it in the gospel lesson for today. Just as you did to the least of these, you do unto me. Friends, today we have a choice to make. We have a chance today to make a commitment to our future. The projects that we have put forward are about our commitment to make sure that the warmth of our fellowship is reflected in the warmth of our worship. They're about our commitment to make sure that all of God's children can be in all of our spaces, regardless of disability. It's about our commitment to answer Christ's call to serve all, to feed the hungry, to clothe the naked, to heal the sick. They're not about our buildings, it's about how we use them to serve God's people. And it's true. We don't know what tomorrow holds, but we know that today is our day to dream big. And we know this, that if 6 days from now the world changes, as it is wont to do, we will have the same mission next Sunday that we do today. The same call that Christ has placed on each and every one of our hearts, and the same hope to guide us. And the good news is that if we find ourselves lost along the way, we will have the same promise. My Spirit abides among you. Do not fear. Thanks be to God. Amen.